Hello, and welcome to the Table and Well podcast. I'm Tennyson.
And I'm Janelle. Thank you for joining us as we discuss topics and give practical tools that help you live, grow, and be in healthy, joy-filled relationship with God, yourself, and others.
For more information and resources, or if you're looking for coaching, connection, and community, please visit tableandwellco.com. We hope you enjoy this podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Table and Well podcast. This is episode number 31 of season 2, and we are starting a new series, or this is the second episode in our series called With. And again, guys, as always, please feel free to download and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite listening platform. New episodes come out every Tuesday. At least we're getting back into that pattern because we've been gone for a while, as you guys may know. So here we are. So, so this is our second part of our series With, and we're going to be walking through the book called With by Skye Jethani. I always make sure I say his name correctly. Skye Jethani. And it's a fantastic book. And our last podcast, if you listened or watched, we really just kind of gave a really broad overview of what these 5 postures are and how we attempt to relate to God.
Yeah.
And you can see them everywhere.
These postures.
The postures, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, you can.
Didn't really give you a lot of... We're still getting in our groove here, guys. It's been a minute. But anyway.
These postures. Got it.
So we did a brief description of each one of the postures. And today we're going to actually spend our time talking about under.
Yeah.
But I know there was a quote that we actually didn't get a chance to read in the last one that was really good that I think would be great to start with today.
Yes. So, life under, over, from, and for God, each seeks to use God to achieve some other goal. God is seen as a means to an end. For example, life from God uses him to supply our material desires. Life over God uses him as a source of principles or laws. Life under God tries to manipulate God through obedience to secure blessings and avoid calamity. And life for God uses him and his mission to gain a sense of direction and purpose. But life with God is different because its goal is not to use God, its goal is God. He ceases to be a device we can employ or a commodity we can consume. Instead, God himself becomes the focus of our desire. But before we can really desire God, we must have a clear understanding of who he is and what he is like. The reason most people gravitate to one of the other 4 postures is because they've never received a clear vision of who he is, and so they settle for something less. And I would like to argue
go ahead.
that they've never received an experience of who God is.
Ooh, yeah.
And not to take this on a complete tangent,
Right.
I'll behave myself, but I think we're missing the witness of God because we've lost the experience of witness with each other.
Yes.
And we've lost, and it's the both and of that of we've lost one, and so we've lost the other, and the exchange continues. And so we've had to learn how to function without God because we've also learned how to have to function without people being with us and safe and being able to stay with through life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we even do this, as you alluded to before, we even find ourselves imposing these postures with other people as well. And I don't know if that'll come back up in conversation, but it's definitely worth holding space. My argument here is that may we become the people. We actually just read this in at the table this last week in John, was it 17?
17,
where Jesus, his last words to his disciples was, may they know who I am by experiencing me through you and through your message. He multiple times through John 17 talks about experience. And it wasn't, may they know you through ideas that I've shared.
Right.
There's a reason why Emmanuel came and was with and still is with.
Yeah. And even the meaning of Emmanuel is God with us. And so.
Yes. And so what we're holding for here and what we're contending for here, even in this conversation, is may we get back to life with God and him with us.
Yeah. And in that too, and as we dig a little deeper into each one of these 4 postures over the next few podcasts, that that you just take a good look at kind of where you are, because it's really done this for me in different areas of life. As when we were reading it and listening to it, and as we've started going over it again, it's like, wow, actually that area of my life really is living under God, or living for God, or living as opposed to being with him in all areas of my life. And so,
and part of my wrestle maybe in this season of my life is that I still expect him to XYZ because of this particular posture. That I have an expectation that I've created that is something other than with.
Yes. So here we go. So let's jump into this a little bit. So again, this is life under God. And so what I want to read here real quickly is kind of what this looks like, and then the fear, because each one of these 4 postures are fear. They're really based in fear and control. And so, because we're trying to mitigate our fears and gain control. And so we've employed these different ways to relate back to God and to other people sometimes too. So under God looks like this. It seeks to control the world through religion by manipulating God through rituals or morality. If you do this, then you will get that. And again, that fear is being subject to the uncontrollable and the happenstances of life. So, this posture is also characterized by the belief that one's primary calling is to live under divine rule in order to avoid divine calamity. So that's that idea of, again, we have to do this in order to get that. And in the book, he talks a lot, he kind of goes back to the ancients and how they lived under God and what that looked like. And
under God's. There was multiples that they had this kind of dance with. That's a great way to put it. And maybe dance is a poor word, because dance is actually very relational, and it's how that's we true. Maybe would describe with. It was definitely more of like a transaction. Like, well, if I give you my sacrifice, then in return I get your blessing. And we see this all the time in the church, where we're talking about this in the same way of, if you worship him, if you give your tithe, if you go to church faithfully, if you abstain from immorality, then God will be pleased with you, which then equals X. And if he's not pleased with you, then that equals X. And somehow, like, that becomes our God. That transaction becomes God somehow.
It's even the idea, I think, something that just hit me in this conversation right here. It's even the very slight shift of when people would say, like, you check in really heavy, or you're having a bad day, or something bad has happened, or something heavy, or tragic, whatever it might be, and the response sometimes that you'll get from people is, well, are you praying enough? Or are you giving your tithe? Are you
like, if you're financially not doing well, are you tithing? As if it is that, and that could go back to the principle conversation too, of it like from God, but this idea of I have to exact my execution of my end of the deal in order for. And I even think it's interesting in the imagery of life under God, like the God out there, who is above me and has all the power and control. In order for me to maintain some control, then I can control my part, my end of the deal of this like bargain that we've somehow made.
Well, it's also this belief, I think, too, because if you go back to the ancients of, like, if you're a farmer, and you are, in your crops. So you give your sacrifice to the sun god and to the water god. And then if it doesn't rain on your part of the land, then it's this idea that the rain god did not accept your sacrifice, or it wasn't good enough. And so
ultimately you are the one who's at fault. You are the one who created that problem. And he's the one to appease whoever, and whether that's the sun god or God himself. We would say that we're really, this is an attempt to appease, right? To appease the one that we might feel is really dependent on our ability to appease. I don't know. It's like, it's so funny how when you start to talk about it and you're just like, how does
that work?
How does this hold up? But yet it's everywhere.
But it's everywhere.
Like when you start to try to explain it, you're like, this doesn't even quite make sense. But yet here it is again in the way that we explain things.
Yeah, and it's again
the way we teach Christianity.
Yeah, all of that. And so it's like, and so going back to that scenario of, well, you're having financial issues, and so someone said, well, are you tithing enough? But it's like, it's the idea of, or are you tithing, are you giving, whatever it might be, but it's the idea of I have to tithe, or I have to give, or I have to serve, or I have to do this in order for this to be good.
Mm-hmm. In order for God to be good to me.
God to be good to me. Like there's a story in the book that he talks about the football player, and I could tell you the teams when going all that. But anyway, overtime, drops a pass in the end zone. And he goes on Twitter and he says, God, I praise you 24/7. I give my tithes. I go to church. He's like, and how are you going to do me like this? Like I didn't catch the ball.
Like it was God's fault that he dropped the ball in the end zone.
Right,
yeah.
But it was that idea of I'm doing all the things that I'm supposed to be quote unquote doing to be good. So
or to do what I think you expected.
Right, mm-hmm. And then you didn't come through for me.
Right.
Well, no, you just didn't catch the ball.
Right, but isn't that so interesting? And then we build like these religious constructs around that as ways to keep people in line, because we also think that if you're not doing your part, then that also could affect me, right? Like if you're not sacrificing you're not doing your part for God, then it might not rain on my crops either, even though I'm doing all my part. Maybe he's actually mad at you because you didn't do enough. And it's this wildness that we then create these cultures, even within our churches, that is about like removing the people who might be compromising God's good response to us. Yeah. It's wild. I was actually in a Facebook group that was asking about, it's Christian women, and it's asking about tithing, and it's a Christian women's business group, and they're asking, do I tithe off the gross of my business, or do I need to tithe off like the profit of my business, as if it was a formula? And I think it's so interesting when we find ourselves like, oh, if I tithe 10% off of this number and not that number, then the prosperity isn't going to come. Wow. That's when we're facing it, right? Is that we somehow think that we actually have the power to control whether or not God blesses us, and that's what's at the juncture here.
Yeah, and so I want to read this right here. This note, it says, "Life under God cannot be a way of establishing a relationship with God because it is actually an attempt to overthrow His rightful place, which is His authority and His control."
Right.
So it's like in the attempt to control God to do the things that. Or not control God, but the attempt to do the things that you think God wants you to do to get the thing that you think you want or that you need, it's actually doing the exact opposite, where it's putting you over God, even though we haven't got to that. That's the next one. But it puts you in this position of it overthrows His authority because it's not how you can. It's just doing the opposite of what you want to do.
Yeah, well, you think you have some control in the matter, right? Yeah. Like you actually think you have some power or some influence over God's behavior. Yeah. Right? Whereas we are finite beings. We believe that we can know and understand things that are beyond, let's say, this realm. Yeah. Right? Like we can understand and ask Him what He wants us to know about things, and we can see into different circumstances and dimensions of circumstances beyond just what's in front of us. But that, in order to do that, it has to be with Him. Yes. Yeah. And this is removing Him from the equation in the way that, this is about me and what I do or don't do, and whether or not it is good enough that then like somehow like flips the switch of you to operate in my...
His response is based on me. What I do. Right.
Which is so wild to think about that. So this is another quote from the book that... I think it's just well worth mentioning. Yeah. Moving beyond the individual, even more destructive things occur when the life under God posture dominates a community. If blessing or calamity is the result of obeying God's rules, then keeping everyone in line becomes the paramount mission of religious leaders. Wow. faith gets reduced to dogmatism, adherence to strict moral codes, and the enforcement of boundaries and rules. In such places, the clergy function as divine police officers and control crusaders, ensuring no one violates the Almighty's will, because it's not just the individual on the line, but the whole community.
Wow. That's so good. That's so good. And it immediately takes me to just the religious leaders of Jesus's day. I mean, we can talk about it today too. Like we can
We'll be kind maybe and not.
Yeah. We're going to stay in the past.
Let's stay in the past. But we can talk about other people.
But seriously, if you look at that, like just how the religious leaders of that day were, they created rules so you didn't break the 10 Commandments, or they created...
Right, there ended up being like tens of thousands of
the exact
statutes when we started with 10.
Yeah.
When God gave us 10.
They added, well, you can't do this. But because it was this idea of we have to do all the right things in order for God to be pleased with us.
Yeah. And Jesus just flew in the face of that so often because he's like, oh, really? Like you can't work on the Sabbath because then God's not going to bless you. Oh, well, what happens if this, what happens if we're doing this? Is it really about the rule or is it about, and he just kept saying, or is it about the being with?
Yeah.
Every time he would bring it back to, even the healing was, hey, I'm with.
Yeah. Is it the rule and the behavior?
Right.
Fixate on the behavior. Did you go to synagogue? Did you pay your tithe? Did you give the right food? Did you do the right thing to wear the right clothes? Did you eat with the right people? Whatever it might be.
And we bump into this. I'm just going to say it. We bump into this in even the way that we relate to others in our culture, right? Like we have moral codes that we want people to live by. We being all of us, right? Mm-hmm. So, and whatever those might be, if people don't live by whatever those codes of conduct that we believe earn them right to positive in their life, then we other them, like we will not be with them, right? Like it is our struggle of, well, and then we put them even under us as if that's how God operates, in that, like, well, you don't live by the standard to which I think you should. You're not meeting my rules and expectations, and therefore
and then we just propagate the whole thing of living under, to where now they feel like they have to do all the right things to
deserve your audience.
I mean, think about even, we've alluded to some of this before, but even just think about in growing up in your home, like, was that something that was even in place as a kid, or have you as a parent put that in place to where it's like, you have to do all, you have to check all the boxes in order to get the good gift from me, or to do to have my, my blessing, or to do whatever it might be. Have we employed this? And even through that, because remember how we experience our home is how we relate to God.
Right. Yeah.
And so have we inadvertently, in some situations, in some areas of our life, made this living under God posture something that is just normal?
Yeah, that's so interesting. And again, like we talked about toward the end of the last podcast, I think, was that the idea is that this does play in, right? There are real things that should be done. And should is a terrible word, but like there's truth and consequence that is real, right? Like and that's part of, back to parenting, of what we're teaching our kids, is that if you plant this seed, this is what's going to grow.
Right. And
you're not going to be real happy when that grows. So I'm going to teach you to not plant that seed. And so what gets offside here is not that that's not true. Right? That we do things and they bear consequences, good, bad, or indifferent.
Yes.
We're not arguing that here.
Correct.
What we're arguing is that we somehow have equated that to whether or not God will be with us.
Yeah.
And whether or not he will bless us.
Yes.
Because that's been life experience, right? Like we've grown up in environments where the good things come based on obedience or based on execution of the task.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to clarify here is that, yes, there is seed and there is fruit.
Yes.
Absolutely. That does not equate to whether or not God loves us.
Yes.
Whether or not he is going to be with us. Now, and that he's not some sort of like mathematical machine that also then equals, if I do this, then I get blessed.
Yeah.
This is where like rains on the just and unjust, that like, how do you live in a world when you see the gift you want being given to other people?
Yeah.
When they've done all the wrong things and you've done all the right things, like how does that make sense?
Right.
And it does not make sense if if our only option is to live under God.
To where because I did all the quote unquote right things and I still didn't get the thing.
Right.
Where do you go from there?
Where do you go from there?
Where do you go from there?
And is there And is there any place to go if that's the only equation you have to work with?
There really isn't. I mean, you can kind of look at if people that live in that space of, I won't say everybody, but most people that live in that space of life under God, when you don't get the thing that you've lived your whole life or that you've abstained from or that you've done all the right things to get, you can become very, very cynical. Mm-hmm. You can leave your group, your gathering of people, even abandon the faith because the bargain, because that's what this is. It's a bargain.
Right.
It's an exchange. Turns out to be a scam.
Right. And I think part of the reason why this is not enough in our relationship with God is because it has nothing to do with our heart.
Yes.
Right? Like we can do all the right things and our heart be very far from him. That's what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
And it looks good from afar.
Yeah. Like, but you're whitewashed tombs. You're doing all the right things, but you actually have no relationship with me. And that's the whole basis of this conversation is ouch. We do that. We do that more than we may want to admit. And we may not see it as clearly as Jatani is drawing out here. And we're just kind of those people who are willing to say it for what it is and say, we do that. Yep. Yeah. And we build whole religions around that and have complete teachings around that, which lead us all into a life and ultimately lead us into a life without him.
Yep.
And so may we become the people who know how to honor and obey and never do that without him.
You've been listening to the Table and Well podcast. New episodes stream every Tuesday. To begin your journey to relational health, go to tableandwell.org/IRH to join our Intro to Relational Health Lab. This is our free 4-week mini course where you will learn skills and practices that will transform the way you engage with relationships. So for more information or resources, go to tableandwell.org.